Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Evolving Textile Exchange Standards to Meet Climate Plus Goals. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions in the question box on the webinar doc. Now on to Ashley with Textile Exchange. Ashley?
Hi, Rose. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very, very happy to be with you today to talk about this transition for the Textile Exchange standards, kind of where this transition came from and how you can be a part of it. I'll just jump in quickly to the agenda that we want to get through today. I will be providing a little bit of background on Textile Exchange's Climate Plus transition, some of the thinking that has brought to the organization, and how we want to use that to influence and to redirect the Textile Exchange standards. We're excited today to be presenting to you an option or an idea that we have around unifying the standards in a more combined, more unified system. We'll look into the details of what that actually will mean practically. And then we were lucky enough to have some very initial conversations with a few of our partner level members, a few organizations that have worked with the standards for a long time, mostly because we wanted to get a good sense of if we were on the right track or if we had maybe missed something. So we'll be sharing some of that initial feedback with you. And we also would love to have you join us in this process. And so at the end, we'll talk a little bit about what participation means, along with some time for Q&A. I don't anticipate that I'll use all of our time today for my presentation, and so we should have plenty of time for questions. So you can, as Rose said, you can put those into the question box. Trini Gantner is our standards manager, and she'll be on with me today to help work through those questions. So with that, I'm going to jump in. And I'm actually going to turn my video off for now so we can focus on the slides. And then whenever we do the Q&A, I'll come back. As many people probably already know, Textile Exchange has been going through a strategic review process over the last 18 months or so. And we're really excited about this new strategic direction for the organization that is focused on Climate Plus. And Climate Plus is really focusing on enabling and guiding the textile industry to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Our commitment is in line with the ISCC target of keeping the global temperature rise below 2 degrees, below 1.5 even, which is 45% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030. And we're focusing still on that pre-spinning phase of textile fiber materials production. That's where Textile Exchange has really always focused, and we want to continue that depth in that part of the supply chain. We also acknowledge through the work that we've done as an organization over the past several years that these kinds of impact areas or issues, they don't really occur in a vacuum. And so if we put blinders on and we only focused on greenhouse gas emissions, we would miss a lot of the contributing factors to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as things that also have can have a really negative impact on the world. And so along with this commitment to enable the textile industry to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're also putting a spotlight and a focus through our work on soil health, biodiversity, and water. So this is really the plus in Climate Plus, but another key part of the plus is partnership. And Textile Exchange, we're focused on these specific climate areas. We're focused on the fiber materials production part of the supply chain, but we know that the textile industry has these goals across the whole sector. And we really feel like by focusing on this part of the supply chain and by partnering really effectively with other organizations that are working in the same area, but in different parts of the supply chain, we can really boost and multiply the positive effect of the work that we're doing. So as we've been moving towards the Climate Plus approach, we've been trying to identify, what are going to be the pathways? What are the key strategies that are going to enable us to reduce our climate emissions, to have those positive effects in the fiber and material part of the supply chain. So these are the key strategies that have come up as we've discussed this, as we've kind of spoken with experts, with our stakeholders. Primarily, or not primarily, I should say, but just first on our list is increasing the uptake of recycled fibers. We know that's a significant reduction away from virgin fibers. And so, slowing the reliance on new materials is going to be a key pathway to get to that 45% goal. The second thing is proliferating regenerative practices. If you really look into the principles behind regenerative agriculture, a lot of those practices really align with increasing the soil health, improving or eliminating contamination of the water, improving biodiversity, sequestering carbon, those types of things. So we really feel like there's a very strong alignment between regenerative practices and our Climate Plus goals. And that's an area of work that we're really excited about. The third area is mitigating land use change. This is a big area that has come up in the work that we've done with the Leather Impact Accelerator, but primarily deforestation, converting ecosystems over to monocrops, to really intensive agriculture, is also a key contributor to carbon emissions. And so that is also something that we are looking at in the work that we're doing, ways that we can incentivize the reduction or the mitigation of land use change. Supporting the transition to renewables, encouraging innovation. These are really important parts of this pathway to 45. But we feel like there are other organizations in this space that we can really boost their work, give them a platform, make sure that we're connected in with them. But we won't be taking the leadership role in these areas to allow those other organizations to continue their good work. Across all of this, improvement of measurement tools and closing data gaps is going to be a crucial part of this. We know that there are currently, there is data right now to kind of illustrate which are the fibers and materials that have a reduction in carbon emissions, but we want that information to improve and to get more granular, and for us to really dig into specific evidence of the practices that do drive these changes, so that we can continue to encourage and accelerate those types of practices. The strategic review also covered not just the Climate Plus vision and goal, but also how Textile Exchange works and the way that we are perceived in the industry. When we did a lot of these stakeholder interviews through the strategic process, something that came up with many of the people that we spoke with was this trusted authority and a convener. Trusted authority because of the standards that we provide, as well as, a lot of companies come to us and want to know, okay, that my supplier is bringing me this material. Is this actually a preferred material? Does Textile Exchange consider this to be preferred? And so we want to really deepen that role of trusted authority through having better data and better assessments and frameworks that help you make decisions around preferred fiber material selection, but also that help the industry understand or have a direction of travel of what those practices are that I mentioned before that are going to actually lead to that positive impact we're all looking for. The other thing we heard is that Textile Exchange is a convener, and that we're known for the network that we have created, whether it's membership, the conference, the roundtables, the international working groups with the standards. This is an area that we really are known for. And we want to take those communities and that network and really push towards co-creating solutions and drive this towards acceleration of our 45% goal. Which brings me to the third value driver, which is accelerator. And this is one that is not as common in our vocabulary. We've, I think, in the past focused a lot on raising awareness, making sure that people understand the impacts and the opportunities that they have to make positive change. And in the next 10 years, we see this really shifting to take a more active, more accelerative role in this space, where we really are pushing for tools that drive incentives back to producers that really offer the ability to scale up these higher positive impact fibers and materials. Many of you will already have a good background on textile exchange standards, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but just to give you an idea, we are we've owned standards throughout the history of the organization, starting with the OE 100 and the OE blended. And I've worked on the standards team since 2012, and at that time there were just 4 of us, and there are many more of us today. The standards and assurance teams, the standards team really focuses on the standard development and the user support. The international working groups are run by the standards team. All the labeling and the guidance that is online is all provided by the standards team. The assurance team leads on the credibility and the oversight of the textile exchange standards, and that's led by Lee Tyler. So you've probably interacted with one or several of these folks, and we're really happy to have such a really committed and passionate team that is also extremely knowledgeable. I mentioned textile exchange standards started with the OE 100 and the OE blended, which has become the organic content standard. And over the years, we've added the global recycled standard. When we took that on, we actually split out the 2 standards to parallel the distinction between the OCS and GOTS. GOTS is a separate standard. It's owned by a separate organization, but it's built on a similar input verification of material from organically certified farms, and then a similar chain of custody that uses transaction certificates. The content claims standard is our chain of custody standard, and that verifies the chain of custody for all of these materials. It also can be used on its own as just a generic chain of custody model. The RDS was our first animal welfare standard, and that one is focused primarily on waterfowl, on ducks and geese that provide down and feathers for both primarily the outdoor and the home industries. That was developed through a partnership with Control Union and the North Face. And after that, we began the development of the responsible wool standard, which originally was focused on animal welfare, but has also included from the beginning land management, and most recently the social module. And over time, we've actually added 2 more fibers to this responsible animal fiber system with the addition of the responsible mohair standard and the responsible alpaca standard. And all of these standards verify at the farm level animal welfare and land management and some high-level social criteria, and then link that to the chain of custody. The global recycled standard is the only textile exchange standard that covers processing requirements in the supply chain. So all of our other standards are focused primarily on the input verification, but the GRS does require social and environmental facility criteria and chemical criteria at the product level that are based off of ZDHC. So you can kind of see the history of these standards. They were really developed kind of one at a time. And now we have a lot of coverage of different issues across the supply chain, different materials. And we've really built up, by using the same chain of custody, built up quite a bit of efficiency. So the chain of custody picks up at the source and then tracks the material using transaction certificates all the way through to the retailer. And this standard was just recently revised. We just released the Content Claims Standard 3.0. And actually, Trini will be leading a webinar tomorrow to go into more detail about that new version and what that means for all of the different users. So if you've got any questions about that, definitely register for that webinar tomorrow. If you're listening to this later on, you can also find access to that webinar recording on our website. I mentioned the standards growth just in number, but we've also seen really significant growth in the past 2 or 3 years of our standards, specifically the global recycled standard, which is this blue line. The green line is the OCS, the organic content standard, and this blue line is the GRS. The RCS has also grown pretty significantly. RDS and RWS have grown on a little bit of a more traditional trajectory. And we are just now getting some of the 2020 numbers finalized. We had a little bit of delay in the reporting, but we do have those numbers, and they're looking to be on par with the same 2018 to 2019 jump. So we've really seen a significant number of, or a significant increase in the adoption of our standards across the system. So all of this background, I think, is really helpful to frame where we are today and the opportunities that we see within our standards as they exist currently, and how they could grow and evolve to more directly address the goals that we've set out with the Climate Plus strategy. So I want to walk through some of those opportunities and what we're proposing to transition. So the goals and opportunities that we see right now are to more meaningfully and directly embed Climate Plus into our standards. When I showed you that graph earlier, you can see that there's a lot of different topics that are covered by one of our standards. We have recycled, which we know is a key contributor to carbon emissions reduction. We have the organic input verification. We know that there's LCA evidence to show that there is carbon emissions reductions with organic agriculture. There's also a lot of positive outcomes related to soil health, biodiversity, and water due to organic agriculture practices. And with the responsible wool standard and the family of standards, including alpaca and mohair, I think that one, even probably more than any of our other standards, actually fully kind of captures this opportunity to address the animal welfare, but also the land management practices. And we're directly verifying those practices on the ground. But with all of our standards, we're not currently able to track a lot of these impacts because the goals of the standards are not specifically aligned with Climate Plus. And we feel like as we are transitioning to this Climate Plus approach to this goal, that there's opportunity for us to make a more direct connection, to really identify the practices that we believe today drive those positive impacts, and also to start tracking those impacts in a more direct and more comprehensive way. The other thing that we see is an opportunity to streamline to a more unified system that could create efficiency in the supply chain. I mentioned before that we use the same chain of custody standard for all of Textile Exchange standards. And what that means is that the criteria that gets applied to a garment manufacturer is really the same criteria, regardless of whether it's responsible down, responsible wool, recycled polyester. It's really the same system that's being applied. And because our standards were sort of developed over time, one at a time, it's led to multiple certifications being required at one specific facility. Even if the auditing is already streamlined, we are looking at potentially allowing for even more efficiency in that process. So potentially, having a site be certified only once to one standard and be able to handle any of the materials within the system. Something that we're already seeing work quite well within the responsible animal fiber framework that Hannah and Callie have been working on. The other opportunity that we see is just stronger communication and association with Textile Exchange. If you look back, I'm going to flip back to this slide again, but all of these logos, if you just saw them as a consumer in the marketplace, you probably wouldn't guess that they all go together, that they're all part of the same system for Textile Exchange. You also probably wouldn't guess that Textile Exchange is the organization behind them. We feel like that on one hand, we feel like it's a missed opportunity for Textile Exchange to really share the message that we have around the importance of materials and the power of really selecting preferred fibers and materials. But we also think that it creates a little bit of confusion, and it's a bit clunky for brands and retailers who may want to talk about materials in a more holistic way. For them to use all of these logos or even just 2 or 3 of them is visually a little bit clunky, and also can kind of detract from the message of the brand itself. And so the opportunity that we see here is in rebranding the standards and moving to a more unified logo that has the flexibility to include things like the material name, things like recycled, organically grown, responsible, but in a more visually compatible way that allows that flexibility, allows companies to talk about the materials as a whole. So it's with all those kind of opportunities in mind that we're looking at transitioning away from talking about Textile Exchange standards as 8 separate standards and thinking about them more as one system of standards. So these key proposed changes are really primarily in the material input verification, the chain of custody, and the labeling. The labeling obviously is going to be the most visual and the one that you see right off, but it really starts with the material framework. We're not currently proposing to change too much about what materials are accepted or what the scope is, but we do want to shift into having a unified framework for all of the criteria that could be applied at Tier 4 or at the raw material level. Secondly, we want to look at chain of custody and how we can create more efficiencies in the certification process to avoid duplication and to really create a more streamlined system from the raw material all the way up to the final product. And then finally, that new way to label, shifting to labeling that combines more of these messages together. So I'll look in just a little bit more detail at each of these different elements together. The material framework, we're thinking about it in terms of the feedstock and the initial processing. So in the criteria applicability, this is the way that we're thinking about it, is that a specific material would have criteria that applied based off of the type of feedstock. So for recycled material, we would apply the same input verification that we have today with the RCS and GRS. We would still distinguish between pre-consumer and post-consumer. We've just recently gone through a feedback process where we received a lot of feedback on the current versions of the RCS and GRS, and all of this would transition into the this input verification criteria. And we would also look at whether there are things that might be helpful to verify to help better track what impacts these recycled feedstocks have, specifically when it comes to carbon emissions, but potentially other of those 4 impact areas as well. Organically grown, we would still continue to recognize organically grown inputs through the input verification. That's part of the OCS. And then when it comes to land-based, Probably the first thing that's jumping into your mind is that there are already standards that cover crops. There are already standards that cover forestry. And what we would like to do is to think about a benchmark or a set of practices and impacts that we want to track across all of the land-based materials, and how we can potentially either just recognize existing programs, or even allow those existing programs to be named and listed somewhere as something that we point to. We don't want to duplicate any existing certifications. Obviously, there's no need for Textile Exchange to develop a forestry standard because there are already trusted, respectable, leading forestry certifications. In grazing, we do see this as being a place where a lot of the criteria within the responsible wool standard and the alpaca and mohair standards would sit. For the land management practices, they could be part of this land-based framework that really is looking at the outcomes that we're looking for when it comes to things like regenerative practices, soil health, biodiversity, and water, but could also be applied directly in the case where a standard was not there. And then obviously the animal welfare criteria that we have in our standards would still be applied as well. So essentially materials would still qualify using the same really similar criteria that we have today, with just this kind of restructured into this framework and layered in additional practices and specific impact monitoring that tracks with our Climate Plus goals. We're also potentially, and again, this is kind of a question that we still have for this process, is looking at some of the initial processing. I mentioned before when I was talking about the Climate Plus goals that our focus is to look at the pre-spinning stage or equivalent for materials that don't go through the spinning stage. So we're thinking about, everything on the feedstock level is fairly obviously tier 4. There are some initial processing that is somewhere between tiers 3 and 4, where there are impacts that do correspond to the Climate Plus goals that we have. Specifically, energy use related to the carbon emissions, and chemical use as a factor in water contamination or water use. And so we're looking at, this is another example where we would love to partner. We are currently partnering with ZDHC on developing some more specific chemical management guidelines for this specific area. We'd love to share more about that soon. But we're also looking at other programs that are out there that address energy use in the facilities, and how we might be able to link up or to reflect some of the work and the thinking that they've done in order for us to track where those carbon emissions reductions are happening within that portion of the supply chain. So that's really what we're thinking about with the material framework. On the chain of custody side, again, we're not looking at a significant amount of changes. I think the thing we're most curious about is what it would look like for us to shift the certification through the supply chain to being just one certification that could allow those facilities to buy and sell any of the materials that had qualified as part of the system. Finally, product labeling and communication. And, I would love to say, here we are, here's the new logo, but actually, as with everything, we really want your input before we come out with something final. We currently have all of these different logos, all these different options. And we're looking at having something that allows for similar language to this, but is more cohesive, more consistent with one another, and also that reflects Textile Exchange as an organization. But we will be going through some smaller focused task force type groups to help us think of all of the use cases for logos, where they're used, where they show up, what kind of flexibility we need to provide, what format it makes the most sense for those to come in. So if that's something that's interesting to you, we'll have more at the end of the presentation on how you can be involved with that. So that kind of sums up the direction that we're going. I mentioned before, we held some very initial conversations, really just very casual, informal conversations with a few of our key members and also organizations that have invested quite a bit in their usage of the standards up to now, as well as some peer organizations. We also spoke to ISEAL, we spoke to some other standards owners. And in general, these interviews were probably a bit heavy on the brand and retail side, but we did talk to a few suppliers as well. And in general, a lot of the feedback was very positive. A lot of people said, we understand why you're doing this. This makes sense, especially for Textile Exchange to have the opportunity to put more of our voice behind just one standard, to kind of focus all of our revisions and those types of efforts through just one standard. We did also hear that by kind of shifting the conversation to a more unified material message, you may lose some of the impact that the standards have on a specific material or a specific claim like recycled or organic. And so we were cautioned to try to find that right balance. Folks mentioned there are a lot of logos and that this could be confusing to introduce another one into the marketplace. We also received some really helpful feedback around just being thankful that we were focusing on materials and that we were not trying to do too much and try to go outside of the space that we really have a lot of knowledge in. We also heard a lot of people say that they had also set climate targets and that they were really excited about having more data and more information from the beginning of the supply chain around those climate impacts. I think I've mostly covered all of that, but I want to go, we've grouped some of these feedback areas into themes. And the first one really is around just labeling and consumer confusion. Make sure the marketing message is simple, but also that it's not so simple that it is perceived as greenwashing, or that it's not clear what the actual message is. So there was a question of whether one logo is actually enough to tell the full story, and some advice to invest in a lot of really clear consumer messaging to make it really clear what we're focusing on. A really quick plug: as part of this process, we do have an online survey up around to explore how brands are currently using our logos and even some other standards in the space. And so if that's something that you haven't participated in yet, but you are a brand, please reach out and get a link to that survey. That would be really helpful for us through this process. The second is around creating efficiency. This was the thing where we received almost across the board positive comments on people want to have things easier for their suppliers. They want the documentation process to be easier. They want the certificates to be faster and cheaper. And so that's a big thing that I think a lot of folks are excited about. Further back in, I should say, this area of work is really focused on the changes that we're making in the standard space. There are also efforts happening around the digitization of the supply chain, of the information that we collect, of the transaction certificates. And if you want to learn more about all of that, you can send us a note and we'll direct you to the work that Yvonne is doing around some of the technology innovations that will make the certification even more efficient. And then finally, I alluded to this a little bit more, a little bit further back, but make sure that you don't lose the focus on the material level. So there are a lot of, I'll just speak for myself, actually. I grew up on a cotton farm, and my family is really proud of being cotton farmers. That's a big part of kind of the identity of our family. That's how we see ourselves. My grandfather, my dad, and my brother are all cotton farmers. And so, for us, if we were going to adopt a standard and it was called, the Textile Exchange material standard, that wouldn't really mean as much to us as something like a cotton standard, or the way that the responsible alpaca and responsible mohair and responsible wool standards feel as a producer. And so we want to really be very intentional about what the farm level certification, like what that experience is like for those producers, so that they still feel like they're part of a system that really represents them, and that they're not kind of just lumped under this huge umbrella where they kind of lose their identity a bit as an alpaca producer, for example. So I think that's a really, really crucial part of the feedback. And we actually first heard that feedback from ISEAL. And then once we had some conversations with suppliers, that was definitely reinforced. So this is a type of feedback that we would love to hear, that we are really interested in hearing from our network. We're planning to go forward with this process, but we are going to do this the way that Textile Exchange does everything, through a multi-stakeholder process. And so this transition for us, in terms of the way that we run our standards groups, we've previously had international working groups for all of those individual standards. And we still will be pushing for stakeholder representation from all of those different materials, sectors, producer groups, but we are going to transition to having one international working group. And that is the international working group that's going to be leading on this process going forward. So later this fall, in 2021, we are planning to launch the new international working group. And that will be the team or the group that goes through this process with us, that drives a lot of the high level decision making. We will also have task forces or smaller groups that represent these additional stakeholder groups, like the recycled experts, land use experts, animal welfare experts, certain recycler producers, all of those types of really specialized subject matter experts. So this process will go through really designing the system, designing the goals and outcomes that we want to have, the level of ambition across all of the different materials, and starting to build out this framework. Our aim is to have this done in roughly 12 to 18 months, which we've been warned is a really, really quick turnaround, but we are going to aim for that. And as we dig into the process, if there are roadblocks and there are obstacles to that, we'll definitely keep everyone updated. We're also interested in potentially piloting product labeling at the same time that the standard is released. So normally the way that this type of process works is that we would go through a revision. The revision, will take 12 to 18 months. And then typically that is the point of release is when that new standard will start to become into effect. And even from that time frame, there is still a transition period. And so the thing I want to just reiterate is that we're not changing anything overnight. So none of these changes affect anyone in the next 12 months. This is something that we are going to do, we're going to take our time to make sure that we're doing it in a way that makes the most sense. We're going to bring the community with us. And then even from the point of release in 2022, we're still looking at least another year of transition time, probably 2 years for some of the labeling changes, because we know that that requires even longer lead time. And so this process is not one that we're going to do overnight. It's going to take some time to actually finalize everything. And then the transition process itself will also take some additional time. So for any of you that are hitting the panic button, please just reach out to us and let us know kind of if you do have any concerns, and we can help you, with your planning. So how to stay involved. There are different ways to participate. The first way to participate is just that you want to stay in the loop. You don't necessarily want to be an active participant in this process, but you just want to stay up to date. And the biggest thing I can say is just make sure that you're receiving Textile Exchange email. We'll be talking about this in our newsletter. We will be reaching out to the community. Make sure that you're receiving our emails. If you're not, just let us know, send us a note, and we can make sure that we get you everything cleared up so you're getting our emails. The second way, which is probably going to be the most active for the longest, is the International Working Group. And this will be the group of decision makers, a representative body that helps us to make these decisions around this transition. The second way to more actively participate is by being part of that labeling group. We mentioned that this fall, we'll be running a smaller group that's focused specifically on use cases around labeling and how to address those, how to make sure that we're developing labeling that really addresses the needs that folks have. We also will be piloting that labeling. And so if you're interested in piloting with maybe a small collection online by next fall, be sure to flag us now so we can get you the information that you need, because I know that a lot of that takes some time to put out there. If you're interested in the International Working Group or in being part of the labeling feedback group or the piloting, you can send an email to standards@textileexchange.org, and we will plug you in to the right spot. So that concludes the presentation that I have prepared, but we still have a fair amount of time to spend on questions. And so please, feel free to drop those into the Q&A, and we will get to those questions.
Actually, we have one question already, which is Textile Exchange planning to complement the organic grown standard with a regenerative standard? Feels like certificates in the space partly take the organic standard from Textile Exchange and build on it themselves.
Yeah, thanks for that, Trini. That's a great question. And I think this is an area where we're kind of looking at what the landscape is. There is the regenerative organic standard, which is exactly as you say. It's kind of building on. It actually is not building on the organic standard from Textile Exchange, but on the national organic standards that are being applied at the farm level that Textile Exchange also recognizes. But one interesting thing that we are working on, which you'll hear more about in the fall, is actually a landscape report on regenerative activities and kind of programs and projects that are happening. And what we're aiming to do is come up with a framework of the outcomes that we want to see on the land side, and then to do sort of an analysis or a mapping exercise to see where there are existing tools that could help fill in that gap that we could point folks to. And if there is a gap in connecting with our chain of custody then we'll look into what that might look like. I don't think that Textile Exchange will launch a regenerative standard. My hunch is that that's probably not needed, given the amount of work and activities that are happening in the space. But we do want to really ensure that anything that we're backing or that we're putting our name behind, even in terms of support, is in line with our Climate Plus goal. So that's the kind of level of evaluation that we're aiming for. But great question.
Thank you, Ashley. Then we had another question, just to reiterate, we will be sharing the slides and the recording after this webinar has concluded, so you will have access to it after.
Great, thanks.
Another question that came to mind is, could you speak more to how the RDS will fit into the framework?
Yeah, that's a great question. Currently, the responsible down standard is the only standard that Textile Exchange owns that doesn't have any specifically environmental criteria. So the scope of the standard right now is only on animal welfare. We will include an analysis of the impacts at that level. Something that Hannah has been working a lot on our impact monitoring for all of the standards, and the Climate Plus team is a new team within the organization, and they're going to take on kind of impact monitoring for the whole organization. And so we've, had a lot of really exciting conversations with them around this mapping exercise that I mentioned, of mapping out where all of the Climate Plus indicators overlap with the materials that are currently within our scope of certification, or within materials that are commonly used in the textile space. And with down, what we're thinking about are that we kind of want to say, okay, we've done this analysis, here's this mapping. We know that there are impacts on water. We know there are impacts on biodiversity, potentially on land use, and let the stakeholder body make the decision on the scope. There's a possibility that maybe for a couple more years, we let the RDS remain focused, or the down criteria remain focused on animal welfare. But I think in the long run, at least Textile Exchange would like to see environmental and even potentially some social criteria be included within the scope of what's applied at that part of the down supply chain. It's a tricky one because down is not, it's not, meat production is not technically part of the textile supply chain. And so applying requirements from a brand is a little bit trickier when it comes to, to the farms and slaughterhouses, because they're not in the down business, they're in the meat business. And so we'll try to make those kinds of decisions on a material by material basis. So again, so we aren't losing that, we're not losing that, that focus on what's most appropriate at a specific material level.
Great, thank you, Ashley. In terms of timeline, you had mentioned that we are looking at a potential release in end of next year, 2022. Another question is, can I keep using the logos I already use?
Yes, as long as you're still, there's been a couple of changes that may affect your logo use. So the claims policy was released last year, and the compliance deadline is coming up. The content claims standard also affects some labeling, because we've changed the scope of the standard of who needs to be certified in order to label, which Trini, you'll go through that tomorrow on that webinar. As long as you're following those principles, there's no changes currently, no timelines for phase out of Textile Exchange certification logos. We will, once we have that release timeline, we will announce what those transition timelines are. My guess, or my kind of wish, is that the timeline for labeling is going to be a pretty long one, because we know that that's a lot harder to make those transitions. We also will say we're really, really excited about the visual direction of the new logos, and really feel like it's something that people are going to be really excited to use. And so we hope that that transition is one that you'll be excited to make with us.
Great. And that is the last question we had. I invite everybody to type in more questions into the Q&A box.
Thanks, Trini. The other thing I'll just say with the time that we have while we're waiting for folks to answer questions is that I just want to say that we're, in one of the conversations we had with another standards organization, they mentioned that one of the hardest parts of this transition for them, they also went through a similar, they're not in the textile industry, but they went through a similar process of consolidating several different standards into one more unified system. And the process that they said was the most difficult was getting internal buy-in. And I, as being in the organization for a long time, Textile Exchange has gone through a lot of changes. And I just want to comment on how excited our team is about this, and that, getting buy-in within the organization has not been a challenge at all. There are a lot of us that are, have wanted this for a while, and we're really, really excited about this process and look forward to working with you all to making it happen. So I just want to, kind of commend our team for their willingness and enthusiasm for this process. So I think that's going to, you're going to see that reflected in the process as we go through.
We have one more question come in, Ashley. Will you still have all the original criteria available in the broader public space that led to the development of the new logo?
Yeah, is that related to how the logo is developed or related to the specific criteria within the standards? I'm not sure I understand.
If the person who typed in the question could please elaborate, then I can read that out loud. Related to the criteria.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, all of Textile Exchange's criteria, requirements, everything like that's always going to be publicly available, just the way that it is now. So we'll still have all of the all the recycle criteria, all of the animal welfare, all of those things will still all be publicly available. Similarly, we will also document the process that we go through. So we received a lot of feedback on the RCS and GRS. We've received feedback on this process, and we will, as we move forward and make decisions, we'll also share some of the thinking around how we made those transitions. So hopefully that answered the question, but everything that's available today will continue to be available in the public space.
Thank you. And that is the last question that I see.
Okay. Well, with that, I think I will pass it back to Rose. Thanks everyone very much for your time. Again, if you've got questions that you didn't get to today, or if you are interested in participating in this process, please send us an email. We would love to have you as part of this process. And thanks so much for your time.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. And again, as a friendly reminder, an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.